The hostel was never truly quiet at night. Even when the lights went out and the corridors seemed abandoned, whispers carried through the thin walls, footsteps echoed across the tiled floors, and laughter drifted from rooms where sleep was the last concern. For me, those restless nights had become part of a routine, though I never imagined how one of them would change the way I looked at friendship, loyalty, and desire. I had moved into the hostel 6 months earlier, unsure of what kind of life awaited me beyond the gates. At first, everything felt overwhelming. The crowded halls, the constant noise, the mix of personalities clashing and blending. Over time, I grew comfortable. I wasn't alone anymore. I had found a circle of friends who filled my days with energy and my nights with laughter. There was Amir with his quick wit and endless jokes that could make the whole dorm erupt in laughter. Bilal, quieter than most, always listening more than speaking, but when he did, his words carried weight. Faraz, whose confidence bordered on arrogance, yet he had a charm that drew people in without effort. And finally, Sammy, the most unpredictable of them all, sometimes brooding in silence, other times bursting with restless energy that could not be contained. Together, they were my world inside the hostel walls. Our bond was not perfect. Arguments flared up, jealousies brewed, misunderstandings lingered, but the closeness was undeniable. We ate together, studied together, and on nights when the world outside felt distant, we sat in a circle on the floor, trading stories that none of us would dare share with anyone else. It was on such a night that everything began. The air was thick with late summer humidity, and even with the fan spinning above us, the room felt suffocating. We had gathered in Sammy's room, sprawled across the beds and floor, tossing around snacks and unfinished homework. The usual banter filled the space. Amir mocking Faraz's new haircut, Bilal shaking his head in quiet amusement, Sammy pretending to be offended before joining in the laughter. But beneath the humor, I sensed a shift, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. There was something in the way Faraz leaned a little too close when he spoke, the way Sammy's gaze lingered longer than necessary, the way even Bilal's silence seemed more loaded than usual. Perhaps it was the hour. Nights had a way of softening defenses, of drawing out truths that daylight kept hidden. Or perhaps it was simply the nature of youth, restless, curious, unwilling to accept boundaries as final. Amir suggested we play a game, something lighthearted to keep the energy going. But the questions asked and the dares given slowly edged into territory that none of us would have crossed in daylight. It wasn't just about fun anymore. It was about testing limits, about daring each other to admit what we had long left unsaid. As the laughter grew louder, so did the undercurrent of tension. I could feel it pressing against me from all sides, like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. My heart raced, though I kept smiling, pretending nothing was unusual. Yet, deep down, I knew something irreversible was beginning. The night was stretching further, as though time itself had slowed to let us linger in that charged atmosphere. The hostel outside our room might have been silent, but within those four walls, everything was alive. Our voices, our unspoken thoughts, our growing awareness of each other. I looked around at my friends, each of them caught in the same strange pull, each of them trying to mask it with jokes and playful dares. We were standing on the edge of something undefined, something that promised both closeness and complication. And though none of us said it out loud, we all felt it. This night would not be like the others. The game began innocently as most things do. Amir, restless as always, suggested a round of truth or dare. It was the kind of pastime that had filled many evenings before, though usually it ended in harmless laughter and exaggerated dares no one truly intended to complete. That night, however, something felt different. We sat in a circle on the floor of Sammy's room, our shadows stretched across the walls by the dim light of a single lamp. The air was heavy with anticipation, though no one admitted it. Amir leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief, and dared Faraz to sing a love song. Faraz, never one to shy away from attention, obliged with dramatic flair, drawing cheers and laughter. But soon the questions grew bolder. Bilal, quiet for much of the evening, surprised us all when he asked Amir whether he had ever secretly liked someone in the hostel. The room erupted in teasing before Amir could even answer, yet his hesitant smile hinted at truths we were not meant to know. That was the moment the energy shifted. What had begun as fun started pressing against boundaries we rarely acknowledged. I watched my friends closely. Faraz's confidence seemed almost rehearsed, as though he enjoyed hiding something behind his smile. Sammy's restlessness made him fidget with the corner of his bedsheet, though his eyes betrayed an intensity he could not mask. Even Bilal, who usually stayed in the background, looked strangely emboldened, as if the shadows of the room granted him courage. As the circle moved from one dare to another, the laughter softened into something heavier. I could feel the tension settle between us, threading through our words, lingering in our glances. What we were doing no longer felt like a simple game. It felt like peeling away layers we had carefully built to protect ourselves. Faraz dared Sammy to confess the biggest secret he had never shared. For a long moment, Sammy stayed silent. His eyes shifted between us before he finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes I feel closer to you all than I should," he said, almost like an admission of guilt. The words landed heavily, and for the first time that night, no one laughed. Amir cleared his throat and tried to lighten the mood, but the silence had already changed the air in the room. I realized we were crossing into dangerous territory, where friendship blurred into something more complicated. The thought unsettled me, yet it also drew me in with a force I couldn't resist. Bilal, who had been watching Sammy carefully, asked the next question. "And what would you do about it if you could?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were searching. Sammy only shrugged, avoiding the answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The game carried on, though it no longer felt like a game. Each question revealed more than we intended. Each dare carried weight beyond amusement. By then, my heart was racing with an unfamiliar mix of nervousness and curiosity. I wanted to believe it was only the atmosphere, the late hour, the quiet of the hostel, the shared intimacy of friends sitting too close. But I knew better. Something within me had already shifted. The dares grew softer, almost careful, as though we were testing one another without admitting what we sought. Amir leaned back against the wall, grinning, but his eyes betrayed a hint of seriousness. Faraz spoke more quietly than usual, his jokes muted. Bilal and Sammy kept exchanging glances, each one briefer than the last, but charged nonetheless. I realized that none of us truly wanted to stop. We were caught in the gravity of our own choices, drawn toward a moment that had not yet arrived, but was already inevitable. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts restless. I could sense the unspoken desire among us, a tension we could not name yet could no longer deny. Outside, the hostel had fallen into silence. The world beyond those four walls no longer mattered. It was just us, a circle of friends bound by secrets, daring each other to reveal what we had kept hidden for far too long. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, I knew one truth with certainty: the night was only beginning. Morning arrived as though nothing had happened, yet everything felt different. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the hostel, cutting across the room where we had gathered just hours earlier. Dust floated in the light, and the laughter that had filled the night seemed impossibly distant. Amir was the first to break the silence. He stretched, yawned dramatically, and muttered something about breakfast, but his voice lacked its usual brightness. The sparkle in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a guarded expression. It was as if he feared saying too much would unravel what we had silently agreed to keep hidden. Faraz, usually the loudest presence among us, sat in uncharacteristic quiet. He busied himself with his phone, pretending to scroll, though I noticed how often his gaze flickered toward the rest of us. Confidence had always been his shield, but now cracks showed beneath it, fragile and unsteady. Bilal kept his distance, hovering by the doorway, as though unsure whether he belonged in the room anymore. The calm listener of the group had turned into a man wrestling with something unspoken, his silence far heavier than words. and Sammy, the one whose confession had shifted the night's course, seemed restless, tapping his foot against the floor while refusing to meet anyone's eyes. I felt the tension pressing in from every side. The room no longer felt like a safe circle of friends. It had become a space charged with secrets we carried in silence. The bond we once celebrated so freely was now complicated, tangled in emotions none of us dared to define. When we finally left the room, the corridors of the hostel greeted us with their usual noise, doors slamming, footsteps rushing, voices rising. Yet to me, everything sounded distant, as though I were hearing it through a wall of glass. The world outside moved on, unaware of the shift that had taken place behind closed doors. Throughout the day, our interactions felt rehearsed. Amir cracked jokes at lunch, forcing laughter that never quite reached his eyes. Faraz argued over a trivial matter, his voice louder than necessary, trying to reassert his old role. Bilal stayed withdrawn, and Sammy, whenever he caught my eye, looked away almost instantly. None of us acknowledged what had happened, but denial did little to erase the memory. I carried a storm inside me. Guilt clashed with curiosity, shame with longing. Part of me wanted to pretend the night had been nothing more than a fleeting mistake, a product of boredom and youthful recklessness. Another part of me couldn't ignore the closeness I had felt, the vulnerability that had bound us together in ways we had never admitted before. As evening approached, I found myself alone on the hostel rooftop. The city stretched out in every direction, its lights flickering against the sky like distant stars. I thought about loyalty, the kind that tied us to friends, to partners, to the expectations others placed upon us. And I thought about betrayal, subtle, quiet, yet powerful enough to alter everything it touched. The night before had not been about romance alone, nor about simple desire. It had been about crossing invisible lines, testing the fragility of trust, and discovering parts of ourselves we had long kept hidden. It was thrilling, but also terrifying. We had stepped into a territory none of us knew how to navigate. When I returned to the room later, the others were already gathered, pretending to study. The air was thick with unspoken words, but our silence had become its own kind of agreement. We would not speak of it openly, not yet, but we all knew that what had been shared could not be undone. I realized then that the night in the hostel was not just a story of youthful mischief or broken boundaries. It was the beginning of something larger, a story of infidelity, discovery, and the complicated truths we carried within ourselves. And though the chapter had closed, the echoes of it promised to follow us, reshaping our friendships, testing our loyalties, and haunting the choices we had yet to make.